And I mentioned that there is one thing that we must do, and if we don't do it, all our efforts will not really resolve into, it will not become effective. And in order to explain this, I'm going to take you to nature again. In nature, we find that those of you who were here yesterday, I spoke a great deal about what nature can do to our understanding of the faith. But I will take you to nature, and you see that in life, if there is a man or a person who, say, eats a lot of food regularly, but he does not move. Can you imagine a person like that? Never moves. He's sleeping all the time, eating and sleeping, or staying up. What will happen to this person? This is not going to be a healthy life. He's not going to be able to live. And even if he lives, he'll be a sick man. The right way of living is to eat your food and then exercise your muscles and move around and work hard. And the harder you work, the more you are healthier. The healthier you are, you see. Now this is a basic principle of life, and exactly the same principle applies in the faith. There may be people who say, well, I will read the writings. But in fact, he may be a scholar. He may become a scholar of the faith. He reads everything. And he may be talk an awful lot as well. But he doesn't serve the faith. Doesn't do anything. That person is going to be unhealthy, going to be frustrating. The real way of life is to read the writings, to say your prayers, obligatory prayers, to live the life, to do all these things we have to do, but just as important, serve the cause of God. And the greatest service today to the cause of God is teaching. So you see now how there is a balance here, the balance comes into it. We are not going to be the people who are going to read and become carried away into the worlds of God or something like that. But we are going to do these things together. We're going to do this so that we can serve the faith. Although there are many things we can do to serve the faith, but I mentioned the greatest of all things in service to the faith is teaching. And I'll explain this to you later on, why this is that the greatest of all things is teaching. Now, serving the cause has been described to us from age to age, from time to time, by Baha'u'llah, by Abdul Baha, by Shoghi Effendi, and today by the House of Justice. Because every period of the faith, time of the Bab, for instance, was a period of itself. The greatest of the work of the Babis then was to teach the faith. That stood in forefront of all other activities. But there were other things they had to do, as well as teaching, which was specific to that particular age. For instance, if you were a Babi at the time of the Bab, you had to teach the faith, but you also had to learn how to ride a horse, really, and to hold your sword, for instance. This was how it was done. It was a special requirement of that age. Then when Baha'u'llah came, again teaching was in the forefront of all the activities. But then Baha'u'llah said, now is the time never to use your sword, but to give your life. And that was a period of great stories of great heroism and martyrdoms during that period of Baha'u'llah and steadfastness. And then Abdul Baha's period, you could say, again teaching was in the forefront. But he said, now is the time to remain steadfast in the covenant. But he said, now is the time to remain steadfast in the covenant. There was a time that Abdul Baha, so much, the cause was attacked, at that time, during the ministry of Abdul Baha, by the enemies from within. These are the covenant breakers. They attacked the faith with such fierceness that if it wasn't for the fact that, as I was mentioning yesterday, the cause of God, the machinery, the covenant was so strong, and with the help of some heroes of the faith, a few who rallied around Abdul Baha like lions and protected the faith, today the faith would have been broken up. But it was because the machinery of the covenant was so strong, they couldn't do it. But during the period of Abdul Baha, the emphasis was on the steadfastness in the covenant. Abdul Baha used to send teachers all over the world to help the friends to remain steadfast in the covenant. We may not have the time to deal with this subject of the covenant. Of course, we can't deal with everything. But now, that was a special period again. But again, teaching stood in forefront. Now, since then Shoghi Effendi's ministry and today, the beginning of the formative age, again teaching the cause is in the forefront. But the specific task of today is the building of the institutions of the faith. Now, you cannot live in this age and do the things which belong to the other ages. You can't say, well, I'm a Baha'i, but I'm going to now learn how to ride a horse and hold a sword in my hand, as the early believers used to do. This would be out of place. But you cannot also, if you are going to be devotedly follow the teachings, we cannot stay away from building the institutions of the faith. This is our task. But teaching and building the institutions of the faith are the two major tasks that the Baha'is of this particular period are faced with. Now, I want to talk a little bit about teaching, which is really, Baha'u'llah says, the most meritorious of all things in the sight of God. It is not just one of the most meritorious. He says it's the most meritorious of all things in the sight of God. Now, why is it? And first of all, I want to mention that there is a great, in my view, there is a great misunderstanding in the Baha'i communities about the purpose of teaching. Often people think that we teach the faith so that we may increase our numbers. This is not the main purpose of teaching. This is not the primary purpose of teaching, although other religions do that probably for this reason. But we must not be under this impression that the main purpose of teaching, I'm saying the main purpose of teaching, is not to increase our numbers. This is a secondary purpose. This will come as a result. The result of teaching is that our numbers will increase. But there is a far, far greater reason for teaching the faith. Teaching is an act of devotion to God. It's an act of devotion. Now, I will explain this to you in this way. Again, we go to nature and look at nature to see what teaching is in nature. In nature, you will find always any object which depends upon upon its life giver. Any object which depends upon its life giver. You know, there is a life giver. For instance, this earth is a life giver. This earth is the mother earth, isn't it? It is this earth which has created everything. Everything which you see on this earth has come about from this earth. So it's like the mother earth. We all are dependent upon this earth for our livelihood, for our existence. So we are dependent upon it. Now what happens is this: whenever such a thing exists, that this is the source of your life, the source of your existence, then all things will be drawn to it. Everything will be attracted to it. Every object, as you can see, is attracted to this earth. Do you notice that? Every object which comes within its gravitational pull is attracted to this earth. This is a love relationship. There is a love between the creator and all the other things. This earth is like the creator, is the creator of all, is the source of life. And so every object which comes within its gravitational pull is attracted to it, just with the force of attraction, which is love. See? This is the law of nature. But, and therefore, the home of every object is to come down and to rest on this earth. When it rests on this earth, then you can say it has reached its destiny. It has reached its home. For instance, you see this pen in my hand. Its real place, the real place for this pen is to come down, to be attracted by this love relationship, to be attracted, and eventually rests on this earth. When it reaches on this earth, the lover and the beloved have reached to each other. You see? The lover and the beloved have reached to each other. And this is a stage of fulfillment, a stage of pleasure. Pleasure for both. The word pleasure really is, in here you can use it. It's a stage of fulfillment. Now this is a physical thing we are talking about. But as long as my hand is in here, you see my hand here? This hand becomes a barrier for this pen to come down and reach its beloved and rests on this earth. Although the force of attraction still exists, there is a force of attraction already even at this time. With my hand in the way, the earth is still want to draw this to itself. But my hand is preventing it. And this pencil now is a state of deprivation. Because its home is not here. Its home is to come down and be joined with its beloved. Is that clear, this sort of a? This is a principle of life. Exactly the same thing applies between God and man. Exactly. God is the creator of all. And again, as I was mentioning yesterday, we are not talking of the essence of God. Let us not talk of the essence of God, because we said yesterday clearly, there is no relationship between the essence of God and man. It cannot be with anything. There's no relationship whatsoever. But this is God revealed to man. There is a love relationship between the two. God loves to draw his soul to itself, just as much as this earth loves to draw this pencil to itself. But men have many barriers in between. Many barriers. We all have barriers. Barriers of veils and barriers. Barriers of, for instance, prejudice is a barrier. It prevents people from recognizing and coming down and becoming united and becoming attracted to their Lord, to their God. Tradition is another barrier. People are born in a tradition and die in the same tradition. It's like being born in a prison and never see outside the prison, and then you die in the same prison. This is what most people are like today, tradition. Maybe in this country you don't have so much attachment to tradition, but there are countries in the world that I'm more familiar with where tradition plays a tremendous role. You don't do anything except what is tradition. There are other barriers. Pride is a barrier. Many barriers. Pride. You become proud of yourself and your accomplishments and your knowledge and your quality and your accomplishments. This is a barrier. Knowledge could become a barrier. Again, because it gives birth to pride. So you see, all people in the world, their soul, there is a force of attraction between them and God. Always God wants to draw them. And that force of attraction is there, but these barriers prevent them from coming and becoming united with their God. Now, the act of teaching, which only a Baha'i can do, is to remove these barriers one by one. And when the barriers are removed, what happens? All the barriers are removed, the soul is attracted to God. And he says, I believe. That moment when he says, I believe, as we were talking about it yesterday, you know, the spirit of faith being born, is when the lover and the beloved reach each other. And this is a state of pleasure. Pleasure. Pleasure for God and pleasure for the soul. Because man and God are the opposite things. And in this life, when two opposites are reaching each other, this is a state of pleasure. It's like the North Pole and the South Pole of a magnet. They're attractive. So you see what teaching is? When you teach the faith, you bring pleasure to God. It's the most meritorious of all things. It's an act of devotion to God because you bring a soul to its God. This is the purpose of teaching. This is the main purpose of teaching. Well, of course, as a result of it, our numbers will increase. That is secondary. Then we can build the institutions of the faith. But therefore, teaching, friends, it's a spiritual act. It is not just something I'm going to teach the faith because the NSA tells me to do it, or because the counselors tell me to do it, or because the House of Justice tells me to do it. But teaching is an essential part of the life of a Baha'i. And it is something that we all will have to be engaged in. There is no question of anybody becoming, if anybody does not teach the faith, well, you'll have to think about it yourself. It's like a person who eats the food, he reads the writings, he may know a lot about the faith, he says his prayers, but he is not serving the faith. Well, you remember I was telling you about this man who eats his food and he doesn't do anything. What happens to him? This will happen. We will not be excited, we will not be able to do anything in life. Teaching is not something that anybody can say, I am too busy for it, really. Except in certain exceptional cases. Very, very rarely you come across exceptional cases. There are, of course, places now that people are prevented from teaching. For instance, if you're living in the Holy Land, you don't teach the faith. But in this day and in these and all over the world, really, teaching is the most important aspect of our life. If we look upon the writings, we find that Baha'u'llah has enjoined on all to teach. I will tell you, our daily life often prevents us from really getting engaged in teaching the cause. Because we are so busy in our life, so busy, we have to do so many things. Even we have to do so many things for the faith that we have not time to teach the faith. And I think this is a very wrong way of approaching it. In fact, I remember some years ago, one of the national assemblies told us in Europe that we had appointed one of the believers who was a marvelous teacher to become a board member, auxiliary board member. We appointed him as an auxiliary board member. And after a few months, the National Assembly wrote to us and said, what have you done? You have made him an auxiliary board member. He was one of our best teachers. And now he doesn't teach the faith. Can you imagine? This is very wrong. In fact, one of the first things we say to our auxiliary board members all over now, at least I always advise them, if you want to do anything, you must be teaching the faith yourself. It's no excuse because I'm a very busy man and I must not teach the faith. Teaching the faith is for everybody. We found in our home that we're very busy, and myself and my wife, but we have to teach the faith, no matter how busy you are. You have to teach the faith. You cannot have an exception. There is no exception. This is the most important function of a Baha'i. And teaching is a personal thing. Unfortunately, things are done in the Western world very impersonally, and we have got used to the idea of teaching in an impersonal way, which will never be right. You have to teach on a personal level. We do most things in life impersonally. Have you noticed that? I don't know what life is like here. I'm not familiar with America. But I know in Europe, if you want to do anything, you won't put your name down for it. You give a box number in the newspaper so that nobody will recognize you. You know, it's impersonal. You don't say anything you want to do. You put a notice in the newspapers. You want to sell something, you want to buy something, you want to see somebody, you put a box number. Even when you want to fight with somebody, you don't fight him directly. You employ a solicitor, a lawyer, to fight for you. You see, everything is done impersonally here. But teaching has to be done personally. You have to come in contact with the soul. You have to love him. You have to then look into his eyes and love him with your heart until such time that you think he's now and then learn a lot about him to see what he believes in. And then comes a time that you can say a little bit about the faith. Now, I want to also say something to you about teaching methods, because I feel, again, this is one of our problems. But this idea of teaching, now let me first say, this idea of teaching, every Baha'i teaches, is something that is so vital. Like every day we must eat. It's just as important as that. The same way that we said every day we read the writings, every day we must engage somehow in teaching. And it's a daily thing. Shoghi Effendi mentions that. It's a daily thing. It's not once a month going from one town to another. It is something daily. I remember, and another important thing that I want to mention here before I give you some examples of this, is that Abdul Baha mentions this, that if we do not teach the faith, divine assistance will be cut off from us. I'm sure you've heard this. Now you realize that God is very loving to all creation. And yesterday we talked about forgiveness. You remember that? We talked about forgiveness and how God's forgiveness, what things it can do with it. And I'm sure that God forgives all the things that people do. But there are certain things which to a Baha'i he cannot do. You see, God's assistance reaches the whole of this creation. If ever for one moment the assistance of God is cut off from people, they are not able to exist. The assistance of God reaches all creation. And God does not withhold his assistance from any human being. As long as they live, he's assisting them in whatever they do. If you go the right way, he assists you. If you go the wrong way, he'll assist you. Even the enemies of the faith are being assisted. Because God does not interfere in our actions. We have the free will. He shows us the way, yes. He sends his messengers, he shows us the way. He throws light upon our path. And he says, this is the right way to come. But it is up to you to choose it. And if you go this way, he'll help you. If you go the opposite way, he also will help you. It's like the engine in a car. The engine does not decide which way to go. But it will give you the power whichever one you decide to go. This is how God acts with us. This is how he... and now, he acts in this way. His assistance reaches all humanity. But it will not reach a Baha'i. Now imagine this, who does not teach the faith. And this is when the Baha'i becomes frustrated in his life. I become frustrated in my life. I become unhappy. Since I've become a Baha'i, I've become unhappy. Since I've become a Baha'i, I have all kinds of problems. It's the divine assistance which must come to us. And I can assure you that most of the problems that we have in our daily life or in our anything we do can be and will be resolved if we become throw ourselves into the field of teaching every day. Then things will happen to us. Great things will happen. One will change. Now, I'm not saying that one should say, oh, well, I have a lot of problems in my life, so I better go and do a little bit of teaching so that my problems may be solved. But I can assure you that many of our problems will be so removed from the scene because you will be elevated into a different world. And these problems will sort themselves out. It will completely go into the background. Now, teaching, which is a personal thing. I was talking about somebody in one of these gatherings some years ago. And a woman came to me and she said, look, I have become worried since you have been saying these things, that we must teach the faith every day, and if we don't teach the faith, God's assistance will be stopped from us. I said, I didn't say that. It's Abdul Baha who says this. Oh yes, she said, I'm worried still. I'm still, in any case, I'm worried about it. And she said, I am a very reserved person. I can't go out and talk to the people about the faith. I feel very embarrassed. I cannot teach personally. And now she said, what shall I do? I am worried, he said. She kept on saying this. I said to her, did you say you're worried? She said, yes. I said, that's very good. Keep on worrying. That's your solution to your problems. Really, keep on worrying. This is a very good solution. If ever we are brought to the point of worrying about something, you're going to do something about it. Do you know that? When you find in your daily life, it's the same thing. If you lose your job, or if your family has some problem and you begin to worry, then you are going to put one foot in front of the other and something will happen. Well, this lady went away and she came back again. She said, I can't rest. We'll have to do something, she said. She said, I'm very reserved. I can't talk about the faith to anyone. So eventually, after talking about it, mentioned to her that, look, you can go, and even though that you say you are very shy or reserved or whatever it is, go out every day. And she said, that's a good idea. She said, I will give 1 hour a day for Baha'u'llah. This is a marvelous example. I think we should remember that. Why not give 1 hour a day to Baha'u'llah for teaching? 2 hours a day, maybe, but the minimum. And she said, I'll spend some time shopping. I spend some time at home. Why not give 1 hour a day to Baha'u'llah for teaching? And discipline yourself. And she said, I will go out. And she went out. She said, I'll go to a cafe. And I sit there. And she said she went to a cafe for 2 or 3 months, regularly. And the next time I saw her, she told me this. She said, it doesn't work. She said, I went there for 3 months, every day. I sat there, and many people came in the cafe and sat in front of me on the same table, shared the table. And she said, I could never bring myself to tell them anything about the faith. And she said, it doesn't work. I've given it up, she said. Now you see what happened in here, really, and this is another lesson we learn, a very marvelous lesson. You know, Baha'u'llah says that once you say you are a Baha'i, and once you enter the faith, He will test you. And always we are being tested, all the time. Remember that. As Baha'is, we are always tested. Now, it's not something that Baha'u'llah has invented and say, I'm going to test the Baha'is. In fact, testing. This is nothing new. This is a law of creation. This is a law of creation. Baha'u'llah mentions in his writings, God will test everything. He says, I will split a hair into 1,000 pieces. These are almost the words of Baha'u'llah. And each piece I will test. Now, test actually is a law of nature. You go to nature and you find tests. I'll give you an example of this. As long as you're sitting, nothing happens to you. But the minute you move, the air will resist you. If you go on a bicycle, have you noticed? When you're going on a bicycle, do you see how the air will resist you? This is nature. This is test. You're being tested. And the faster you go, the greater are the tests. The greater is the resistance. You see these aircrafts which are built up, which go twice the speed of sound. They go so fast that the air will resist it so much that the metal gets red hot. And they have to have a cooling machine inside to cool it off all the time, because it goes very fast. Nature will test it all the time. When Baha'u'llah says, I'll split a hair into 1,000 pieces and test it, this is true. Because if you look at the atoms, they're all the time under test. Each atom inside it goes through this cycle. Test is part of life. Every one of us are tested every day without knowing it, maybe. When you become Baha'i, especially. When you sit in a local spiritual assembly, we are tested all the time. It all depends how you look at your friend across the table. Just look at her like this. That's enough. I'm being tested. You know? You think of him in a wrong way. Not with love. Because Abdul Baha says the standard of consultation is love. Now if I look at somebody when he says something and I want to hit hard at her, you know how it is? Hit hard. Saying such a thing. I'm being tested. Hit hard in my heart, I mean. You know, I hope we don't get to action, but it's no use also to cover it up and be very nice and smiling, and then you hate in your heart or dislike in your heart. That is what matters, what's in our heart. You see how we are tested? And so I am tested. And when I am tested, I cannot progress anymore. When you cannot pass the test, but if you pass the test, do you know what will happen? In our lives, when you are a Baha'i, when you pass the test, then greater field of service you enter into it. You will get to do greater service to the faith. You will want to do that. And as soon as you enter there, your tests become greater. Just like somebody who will go faster. Just like the aircraft which goes faster. Your tests becomes greater. And this is why people who have had not the capacity to pass the test, if they are in a higher position, higher functions, higher duties, they could easily destroy their souls. It's like a person who is flying in an aircraft. You see, if I'm standing on this platform and if I fall, well, I may hurt my knee. But if I'm flying in an aircraft and fall, that's the end. So if I work in a local spiritual assembly or a national spiritual assembly and I have all these ambitions in my heart and I'm not able to do the things right and I am being always, don't pass the test, I might hurt myself a little bit. I might become irritated, I might become cause of problems, but it is not fatal. And this is why those people who were close to the center of the faith, those who were close to Baha'u'llah, like man who flies in the aircraft, or those who were close to Abdul Baha, or those who were close to Shoghi Effendi, in the world center, if they had slightest impurities in their lives, if there was any feeling of ambition in their hearts, that little ambition will be magnified and will destroy them. You see? This is the history of our faith. This is why people who were very close to the center of the faith, a little bit of ambition, they will be destroyed. There is no room for ambition in the faith. And especially those who served near the center of the faith, their criterion must have been servitude, absolute servitude, like Abdul Baha. He was safe. The purest branch was safe. The greatest holy leaf was safe because their standard of life was servitude, utter servitude and self-effacement. But the other family of Baha'u'llah, they all had ambitions. They wanted to be leaders. They wanted to be respected. They wanted to be honored. They wanted to be somebody. None of them endured and none of them could last. They all perished, destroyed themselves. They were very close to the center of the faith. But there must have been a lot of other ambitious people in the faith, locally, nationally. Well, they hurt each other and hurt themselves, but it is not necessarily going to be fatal. So you see, friends, one of the things to bear in mind is that tests come our way, always. I remember somebody said, there was a very outspoken, beautiful woman who passed away, a marvelous person who became great. She brought so many people into the faith in England. But she was outspoken, and she used to say, you know, when I was not a Baha'i, I had no problems. He said, I had no problems with people. I was very happy with everybody. I had no problems. But as soon as I became a Baha'i, then problems appeared after the other, you know. And this may be in one sense true if you are not able to cope with it. If you are not able to really approach people with a loving attitude and pass the test. God always tests us. Now, this woman that I was talking about, who was sitting in a cafe for 3 months, and people came in front of her and sat there, and eventually she couldn't say anything, and she said, although I trusted Baha'u'llah and relied on him, he said, go out and I will assist you. He said, he didn't assist me. Now, this is how we are tested. God tests us to find out how much faith we have in him. This is true. When you arise to serve the faith, you teach and nothing happens. And then you say, well, it doesn't work. So what happens? Really, you're losing your faith in him. This is how he tests you. And when I pointed this to her, she said, you are right. She said, I've been tested, of course. She said, it's my fault that this didn't work out. It is not Baha'u'llah's fault. It's my fault. Because I was not dedicated enough. I was not pure enough. I was not taking Baha'u'llah with me every day. It's my fault. And she said, now that you say, I'm going to sit there every day. I'm going to go every day, 1 hour a day. And I will go if it is necessary for years. I will not give it up. And if anything does not happen, it's my fault. And she went. And she was telling us the story after 2 or 3 weeks. She said, a woman came along and sat in front of me. She said, I couldn't say anything, of course, to her, but she looked at my ring. And she said, what is this strange lines on your ring? Oh, she said, I became so nervous. I couldn't say a word now. She said, I was absolutely nervous. And I began to stammer. And the more I became nervous and stammering, this woman became more interested. You see? She said, what is it? Well, I think she told her very little, and she said, look, you better come in here. Somebody will explain this to you. And well, I can tell you this woman is a Baha'i. And this other lady is no longer a shy, reserved person. She is one of the best teachers, you can say. She's going around and teaching. It's like a child who has never had a food before. You give him a little taste of it. Once he gets the taste, he likes it then. And then it becomes a habit for him. This is the way teaching is. And I feel the idea of 1 hour a day, or 2 hours a day, or 3 hours a day, whatever you like, you choose, is a marvelous idea for giving ourselves to Baha'u'llah for teaching, personal teaching. Now, it is very important that we must remember the difference between teaching and proclamation of the faith. And this is something, again, that I think in most communities that I am familiar with, we are mixing up the two. And as a result of this, we are harming rather than helping. You see, I feel that many people who hear about the faith and they don't come to follow it up is because of the unwisdom of the Baha'i teacher. We say the wrong things at the wrong time. We say too much. We kill him off in the first encounter. Really. We kill him off in the first encounter. And this happens, I believe, a great proportion of people who hear about the faith and do not come in is because of the unwisdom of the friends, of our teachers. And I will explain to you what I mean by this in practical terms. The first thing which happens is that we are so used in doing impersonal teaching that we think when I hold a public meeting in a town and I advertise it and people come there to hear about the faith, I think I'm teaching the faith there. I'm not. That is not a platform for teaching. If you begin to teach the faith there, you are going to do some harm. Now, I'm going to explain this to you because I'm sure some of you may be surprised to hear this. Of course, when you go behind the radio, television, and the newspapers, you cannot teach the faith there. You can proclaim, you can give the message of Baha'u'llah. It's very different from teaching. To give the message of Baha'u'llah, yes, you do that. In a public meeting, in a hotel or somewhere, you hold it and you advertise it and people come there. Because people who come to the public meetings, they have never heard of the faith before. Or you must assume they have never heard of the faith before. You cannot teach a person that you do not know. That's a basic principle. But you can give him the message. That's all you can do in a public meeting, is to give him the message of Baha'u'llah, what it is. But we must not make an attempt, in my view, to teach them there. It's very different from giving a message and teaching. Very different, completely different. To give a message, yes, there is a public meeting, you are behind the radio, behind the television. There are certain things we must remember to do and certain things not to do when you are giving the message. I'm just talking about proclamation activities, like giving the message of Baha'u'llah in a public meeting. Remember, I'll tell you another story which perhaps will illustrate this. There was a man who for 10 years was telling me did not become a Baha'i. And I asked him why. What's this? He said, the first public meeting I went to, somebody was talking about spiritual things, said spiritual assembly, spiritual this, spiritual that. Several times he used the word spiritual. And he said, I thought Baha'is are spiritualists. And I didn't like spiritualists. So any time during these 10 years that people talked to me about the faith, I said, this is not for me. You see how one innocent word could get into somebody's mind in the wrong way and deprive him of coming close to the faith. Well, I'm not saying it was bad to say spiritual things, but this man got the wrong end of the stick. People who have never heard of the faith before, never heard of it before, if you give them a talk which is full of new things, it's too much. They are going to hear some things which they do not maybe understand or may do not accept. And you always remember the things that you do not accept. If you put yourself in this place, you go to a meeting somewhere, meet some people. They are going to talk about their ideology. What remains with you are the things that you do not accept. Now, say for instance, now you go out today, hold a meeting, public meeting, invite people there, and somebody stands up and talks about the faith. Innocently, very innocently. Say for instance, do it this way. Say, you know what the Baha'i faith is? It's the faith of love. We love everybody. We love each other. Yeah, do that a couple of times. People who have no spiritual background, they're going to say, these are the people that we were hearing about. You know, this laxity in their moral standards is such that they say they love each other. Now, you see, you have to be very clear of what you're saying. You have to be so clear in what you're saying that it will not give people the wrong impressions, the wrong things. And therefore, we come to this conclusion that in such a talk which is given to the public, giving them the message of Baha'u'llah, not teaching them, we must be concise, we must weigh our words, we must not confuse the mind with a lot of names and histories, starting from Shiraz and the Bab, and then the Siachal and Tehran and Baha'u'llah and Adrianople and Akka and Constantinople and the house and the Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi and the House of Justice and the teachings and the laws. This, you're killing him. You're finished with him. You're trying to give him the message. You're not teaching him here. You're giving him the message. Now, Shoghi Effendi tells us how we should give the message. He says you should follow the example of Abdul Baha's talks in Europe and America. You read the talks of Abdul Baha in Europe and America. Do you know what it is like? It's 10 minutes, sometimes less. And if you take out 10 minutes talk. And what does he say? Never a controversial subject. Never a theological subject, which somebody could come and argue with you. If you ever create a person who comes and argues with you when you are giving the message, then that's the end of it. We must give the faith, when you give the message in a public meeting, should be so simple, and talk about something that people cannot disagree with. So that when the man leaves the hall, he will say, well, I agree with this. That's good enough. You have done a good job. Remember, you are not teaching him the faith. Look at what Abdul Baha said. He talks, I'm saying you should say Baha'i. You should say the word Baha'u'llah. But please don't use the word Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi and all the rest of it. You're confusing the man. Just Baha'u'llah is enough. What is the difference? And then what you can say, as Abdul Baha said, if he ever wanted to say something about Baha'u'llah, and he said Baha'u'llah has come in Persia, he has brought us these teachings, and many people have changed as a result of this. Their hearts have changed. They have become beautiful people. And today I want to talk to you about one of the teachings or two of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. And that's it. And what he said, it was something that nobody could disagree with. Now this is giving the message. But what we do, we go to teach the faith there in a public meeting. You can't do that. And I feel this is one of the problems we have. One of the major problems we have is this. We have to know how to give the message. You go and meet somebody in the streets, you want to tell him about the faith. You can't teach him there. You have to give him the message in a very nice way, in your own way. Whatever you say has to be simple, to attract him to yourself, to attract him to the cause. By all means, you can talk about some teachings, there it is, but not to go involve yourself in like a football match. You say something and he says something else, and you say something and he refutes and you refute, then that's the end of it. Our teaching is different from this proclamation and giving the message. How different it is. Teaching, I'll tell you quickly now, in 2 or 3 minutes. Teaching, if you want to teach somebody, and this is what Baha'u'llah has said, this is what Abdul Baha has said, you must know that person. You must come to know him, you must love him, and sometimes maybe you have to approach him for months in your spiritual arms. You must embrace him, pray for him. And then, when you know, and then you begin to know him, and then you know what he believes in. How can you ever teach the faith to somebody without knowing what his beliefs are? Is he a Muslim? Is he a Christian? Is he an atheist? Is he an agnostic? What ideas he has? And then, having known all these things, and having loved him, and having attracted to him, you can bring him to your home and give him a cup of coffee, and there you can sit down, and then Baha'u'llah says, give him a little thing, not too much, just a little. He says, when you're dealing with a child, you give him milk, not a big meal. If you give him a big steak, he's going to go. You must decide what is then the best thing to give it to him. What's the best thing? It's just like his doctors. I know, for instance, in our family, my wife is very fond of this homeopathy, and I think it's a very good way of dealing with medicine and medical things. Now, how do they do it is that the doctor will recognize in you what you need to stimulate you, and he gives you a little bit of it. And that little thing which he gives you, stimulates you, is ready for the next dose tomorrow, in a few hours. And it's the same thing with the faith. You must know the person in wisdom and tell him some things. And sometimes you must not tell him some things. And even if he asks you a question, if you tell him something, it will be too much for him. It's going to put him off. You don't have to answer every question. You'll have to be able to bring him back to square one, which is the origin of the faith. It's the same thing with any profession. If you're a carpenter and somebody comes to you and he says, look, I don't know anything about carpentry, but I want to make this table with you today. You won't let him to make this table with you today because this fellow doesn't know how to hold a saw in his hand yet. You have to teach him first, prepare him for it for months before you can say, now this is the way you make the table. It's the same thing with the faith. If he has a basic question which is far ahead of him, you have to bring him back to the origin and try to begin to teach him. There are many things, and this is not a platform, I'm afraid, for explaining how to teach the faith. But in Europe, I hope that I'm hoping that as we go back now, and in some countries in Ireland, we've had some seminars for this, of how to teach the faith. And it has been, I think, useful, because it's essential to know so many things. I'll give you one example of this and then I'll close. One person came to us, a woman, she said, I have a friend. And I have met him, she said, only a few days ago. I've told him about the faith. and I wanted to talk to him. I said, well, I can't talk to him unless I know what he believes in. How can I tell him anything? Oh, she said, he just knows about the teachings. He's an open-minded person. He's an educated person. Anyhow, he came to our house, and we sat down, and it wasn't in our house. It was somewhere else. He came in, and he said, well, look, I've heard about your teachings, and I like it. And I saw he's a very enlightened man, a businessman, very educated, and so on. But he said, one thing I cannot accept. I want my freedom to drink alcohol if I want to. Nobody is going to tell me I shouldn't. I know when to stop, and I know I'm an adult, and this and that. Now, what am I going to do with him? If I begin to tell him all the bad things about alcohol, he is going for hours to argue with me. When we are going to enter into argument like a football match again, backwards and forwards. He says it, and I will say it, and this is no use. But you know, if this man becomes a Baha'i, this would be no problem for him. He'll give it up. Isn't that right? This will be finished. There's no problem. Now for me to try to explain to him the good points and the bad points is very premature. So what I said to him, which was surprising, this lady was surprised. I said, don't worry about alcohol. It can be resolved. Oh, we can resolve this for you. Now this man thought I'm saying that we can give him a special dispensation. But you know, it is true. It can be resolved. I said, let us talk about other things, which are fundamental things. You don't have to answer every question which comes to you. And then you involve yourself ahead of time, like this carpenter who involves himself in making a man who doesn't know how to hold a saw in his hand to make it. If somebody comes to you and he wants to know about electricity, you can't tell him what electricity is. You tell him, go to college for so many years, learn mathematics and physics, and then come to me, I'll tell you what electricity is. It's the same thing with the faith. If somebody jumps ahead of you, you have to bring him back to the origin. These are some of the techniques that we have to have in teaching the faith. You have to be wise in teaching the faith. Well, now, friends, I think we are far exceeded our time, huh? And that we will probably come back again this afternoon, maybe. We'll see what will happen. What time it is, Mr. Chairman? 1:30. Oh, you have to eat very fast. This is one thing.